We continue the conversation and the summit here. We have an excellent panel coming up about transatlantic trade resilience. A lot of talk is happening, regarding the transatlantic ties, and I have two experts with me to talk with them. Daniel Hamilton, President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Hello, Daniel. And Hoshuk Lee Makiyama, Director, European Center for International Political Economy. Both of them are virtual. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us at the Greek Economic Summit. So unless you want to start each one with very short, let's say, remarks, introductory remarks of 1 or 2 minutes, I can dive into the questions. Daniel?
I think it'd be good. Let's go to the conversation.
Okay, all right, thank you. By the way, with Mr. Hamilton, the American Chambers in Europe, we have a long standing relation because he's one of the authors of the study that every March we are publishing with Amsham EU about the course of the transatlantic ties. So I'm diving into the first question is, July-August joint understandings set our tariff changes and regulatory cooperation, but the discussion still holds regarding safeguards, review clauses, and even sunset provisions to protect sensitive industries. How can implementation be structured to promote stability and resilience without triggering protectionist backtracking? Are any possible monitoring or review mechanisms that we find essential for this? Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say how pleased I am to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. The schedule just didn't work, but I'm glad that you're having this event. And if you were looking at that Transatlantic Economy Survey, you just go to transatlanticrelations.org and you can find the whole book there. It has all the latest information on the transatlantic economy. I think the basic rule I think companies have to live with, unfortunately, is that uncertainty is the only certainty these days in the transatlantic economic space. The July-August understandings were not a real trade agreement. They're simply the first installment in ongoing negotiations. So what was agreed there could come unstuck easily. You saw they had another stage in those negotiations just last week in Brussels. And many of the provisions there have not even taken effect yet. On the EU side, the Parliament and the European Council still have to sign off on the Commission's proposals as part of that understanding. The Parliament, everything I know about the Parliament, is unlikely to even support the arrangement at all. So I think we're headed for a major issue there probably by February. And on the US side, the very legality of the tariffs that the president has imposed is being questioned. It went to the Supreme Court and with the result uncertain. And so we're going to have a decision, a legal decision, but that's also not till next year. So uncertainty hangs over all of this. I think then on your specifics, the US continually revises its list of steel and aluminum derivative products that could subject additional EU products to this 50% tariff. And the framework agreement didn't even address other areas of the economy that are quite important, like services, digital regulations. And you see that US officials are pressing the EU very strongly on the digital regulations and other regulatory issues. The American ambassador to the EU has an op-ed today in the Financial Times going after another EU directive. On the other hand, I think sometimes the negativity, which is probably justified, overlooks other elements that were agreed in that framework, which are more positive. The two sides did agree to work on critical minerals. They agreed to talk about high standard commitments related to intellectual property, to try to work to eliminate forced labor and supply chains. And most importantly, I think related to resilience is to strengthen economic security alignment on supply chain resilience, talking about the euphemism of non-market policies of third parties, which the EU insists on means China. So working on that, working on inbound, outbound investment reviews, export controls. So I think there is a conversation that's more positive to be had than just the negative, but we should understand that all of this remains uncertain. It's just going to continue to prevail as far as I can see.
So do you feel optimistic about the results, even if they take some long time to, let's say, to conclude with some final agreement? Do you feel that things are going to the right directions, or
Well, I don't think there'll be a final agreement, frankly. And I think the current agreement is likely to be questioned and probably not hold up. So even what we have right now is very tenuous. As I said, it can change anytime. And so I'm not that positive. I'm positive only in the one sense that we didn't have a full-blown transatlantic trade war, but that doesn't mean it won't come about at some point.
thank you. Professor Makiyama, what's your view on that? And do you think we will have some kind of agreement in the next future? What are the risks that are on the table right now, or let's say the critical issues that we need as an EU to handle very, very fast and efficiently?
Well, I would perhaps say that, well, first of all, that, thank you for having me. Uh, I too have had a long history with the AmCham, and it's an honor to be back. And I would perhaps also say that Dan laid out the pieces very, very well in terms of the volatility of the deal. In fact, I wouldn't even go as far as say there is a deal. I mean, basically, it's a framework for rebalancing. And there is a pathway, and there's what we would say in trade speak. There are modalities of a deal that are in place in terms of we know what the moving parts are. But I also know when it comes to negotiations that no one pays for something that is uncertain, i.e., as long as the Supreme Court decision is still out, and and we have the position of the not just the European Parliament, but also certain elements of the Council not taking a firm stance until, well, until you know what you're paying for, so to speak. Nobody pays for something that they can get for free. So basically, we have a roadmap, but that's just about it. But I would also perhaps rebalance some of the comments that Dan made by saying that, well, I'm sure that you agree too, Dan, that there has been a uneven balance between Europe and the US in the transatlantic relationship. This is not the most elegant way to rebalance that relationship and get more out of the European side in terms of commitment. It was perhaps inevitable, but in the end, this was perhaps somehow bound to happen. And some of the outstanding issues that we still look in front of us, I'm thinking, for example, items like steel, and which has been linked to digital regulation, DSA, DMA, and also the AI Act, is perhaps something that are, let's say, known issues. Perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that further, but none of that is very surprising to either parties.
Thank you. Speaking about the Supreme Court's anticipated decision, okay, in case that this is that comes against the tariffs, do you think it will the government, the U.S. government, will come up with something different in terms of imposing some other kind of policy related to tariffs? Professor Hamilton?
Yes, I think there are a number of provisions in U.S. law that would allow the president to continue a sort of a punitive trade strategy. They would just look differently. And so it's very hard to tell. Um, so it really depends on what the Supreme Court says exactly, that would determine which avenue the administration might choose. But there's also the question if it's a decision in which really the entire framework doesn't work, then the administration would have to find a way to pay back all these revenues that is collected, which would be very, very messy and very, add to the uncertainty again. There's also the inner U.S. issue that, trade is actually the preserve of the U.S. Congress, not the president. And in order for any balance, back to a balance, there's a balance that's out of balance in the United States right now, in which the Congress has basically given up its authority on trade to the executive branch. And if this all collapses because of Supreme Court decision, you might see some greater interest, let me say, in the Congress in asserting some of their role again. I can't, the US, the government, the Republican Congress hasn't shown much backbone with the president, but if this collapses and there's legal implications, then you might see some further uncertainty because of a power play between the executive and the legislative branches. So it just adds the uncertainty. It just underscores, I think, the point both of us are making.
Thank you. I will continue with a question regarding, okay, so far, to my understanding, the US consumers do not see any sincere impact from the imposing tariffs, and maybe because the companies and importers have stockpiled before the tariffs large quantities of let's say imported goods. They're saying that probably we'll have some results or some indications the first half or the first quarter of 26. Do you think that if the economy slows down or the consumer index goes down, do you think this will affect maybe the decision whether we will continue the tariffs or we will reduce them? Professor Makiyama?
Oh, that was for me. Well, let me put it this way. I mean, let me phrase the question slightly different. I mean, we talked about the imbalance between the EU and the US, but there's also domestic imbalance in the United States. One case that I always make is that we all know that the United States is the most productive in terms of both capital and labor productivity. It's also the most technological advanced economy in the world. And you can't, as a Republican or a Democrat leader today, explain to your voters why you're suffering a trade deficit. You just can't. I can do it to a central banker, but I'm not really sure if I can do that, or I can probably do that to any one of you in the room, but I don't think I can do that to a Republican voter. I just can't. And that's a huge narrative gap that needs to be addressed. And also, if you look at the US macro, I mean, it is kind of out of whack. I mean, consumption is way too high, and we all know about what the state of is in the current account. And if you take, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of what Doge is doing, but I do see and understand why you need to get the public spending under the control. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to go to a trade war, this is probably your last chance. Trade war is not the only way to address the macro imbalance. There are certainly more constructive ways. Obama administration tried to do that through market access, and that clearly didn't work on the short term. And I'm asking myself if I'm going to be a little bit self-critical as a free trader. The question is whether it would have ever worked. So putting all that together, I would say that a lot of what President Trump, please don't quote me on this, but a lot of what Donald Trump has been saying sometimes makes sense. It's not about 27 dolls that a girl's supposed to have. It's actually about consumption rate being a little bit too high, maybe 3-4% too high. And you probably need to get at least a couple of $100 billion of public spending under control. And that's something you need to do if you don't want to have, runaway inflation despite these tariffs. And put all that together, I mean, what you end up with is actually a macro that is probably more similar to, let's say, France or even Greece for that matter. From that point of view, it's kind of difficult to criticize the United States to try to have a more balanced economic structure like Europe has. So, in other words, it's probably not, there's never a good time if a trade war, but if you want to fight a trade war, if you want to fix these domestic imbalances and you want to basically externalize them and try to solve them through trade, now is probably the last chance for United States to do it. Not saying that that's the right way to go, but if you're going to go down that path, this is the last chance.
Professor Hamilton, your views on that?
Well, we're about to release a update to our study. I think it'll be released by AmCham the next couple days. And if you look at the first 6 months of this year, what you see is that U.S. exports to Europe, goods exports, jumped really high. But imports from Europe went up even higher, so that we have even a higher trade deficit, merchandise trade deficit with Europe than we did last year, 40% more. So if that's an aggravating point, then this is the opposite of what the tariffs were supposed to do, because a lot of companies front loaded, they were anticipating this. So it just reflects these factors. The other is that the US dollar, has declined, I think 10, 11% against the euro in the first 9 months of the year. So that had an factor. The services is the other way around, where U.S. services surplus with Europe is still high, but not as high as this big merchandise deficit. So the politics of that is still quite aggravating. The other thing to keep in mind, though, the way the transatlantic economy works is the investment flows really direct the trade and are really the dynamic. And there, U.S. investment in Europe in the first half of the year basically dried up. It's down almost 80% from the year before. That's not good for Europe, because U.S. infusion of investment is critical. And so I think one needs to look at these other factors besides, just the trade itself. I think ultimately where people stand, it'll depend on this, again, Supreme Court decision, but it'll also depend on basically the basic state of the economy. Will we have sort of an AI crash? Will inflation not, it's sort of stalled. The decline in inflation sort of stalled. So in the US, there's still quite a bit of discussion about these things. And the uneven impact of economic growth on certain regions of the United States becomes important in an election year next year. We have our midterm elections, because in certain congressional districts, the impact might be difficult. So these are all factors, at least from the US point of view, that one should think about.
Can I just add a small
sorry,
point
yes.
there, if I may? And one is that we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the inflation, i.e., there is no export-led growth to be had under the current circumstances. Many of these factors that Dan is pointing to are absolutely short-term. But if you look at the impact of the tariffs, and if you look at adjustment of macro that I just described, that's at best medium-term, probably long-term. So in other words, you're rigging the economy for an equilibrium that it's basically isn't there yet. That's the first. The second point I just wanted to mention is that we shouldn't look too much on the services trade balance that is in favor of United States, because largely that is profit shifting. In other words, we are actually not exporting. I mean, I say this as a services expert and who actually negotiated services between Europe and other countries, that the biggest, actually, our biggest deficit here is largely due to the fact that US companies are using services, intangibles, to shift their profits, the investment link that Dan is talking about. If you look at the biggest trading partners of the United States in Europe, it's not the countries that you would expect. It's Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Ireland. What do they have in common? a lot of US companies have their letterboxes there, and then they remit their profits back to the home countries. So in other words, services actually is a part of the investment compact rather than actual trade in services.
Thank you. About the green transition, we know that is reshaping trade flows. How should the transatlantic partners coordinate so climate ambitions don't become new sources of trade friction, or maybe they already became? So, is it possibility that we can align standards or border measures while scaling clean tech, and where we should start from? Professor Hamilton?
Well, again, a rational answer to your question would take us down one road, but the politics of the moment make even sort of common sense proposals seem otherworldly, unfortunately. That doesn't make it irrelevant, however. So, if you ask me what could we do, and politics aside, I have argued for some time that the US and the EU should create what I call a TACTA, a Transatlantic Clean Tech Agreement or Alliance, that really harnesses the full potential of our combined economy to address kind of a real serious issue of the green transition, but to do it in a way that still promotes growth and innovation. So again, companies use the full transatlantic economy to be globally competitive. So, and the innovation flows across the Atlantic are the densest in the world. That's how the companies work. So we need to harness that potential to accelerate scale up commercialization of really promising technologies, long duration energy storage, green steel, sustainable aviation fuel, food waste technologies, sustainable agriculture, wind power, and so on. They could do a lot of things there. Streamline, standardized licensing. They could unlock the demand for these innovations. They could channel capital to the sectors and technologies that have untapped potential. The second area is they need to bring in the private sector more, as they consider, as public officials consider how to do this. We need, public-private partnerships and pre-competitive research and development, and a lot of these clean technologies, next generation batteries and things like that, clean hydrogen. Um, and, we have huge budgets in both sides of the Atlantic for these areas, about double what China spends. And so we could do much more if we would simply put this together. I've had lots of conversations where I see that the policymakers are talking to each other and the innovators are simply not in the room, and they don't even know these people usually. And the innovators and the venture capitalists and others who fund them would have a different set of priorities, usually the policymakers, and yet they're not talking to each other. So you want to create a framework in which you bring those people together and connect them. And I think that's, stakeholders have to be involved in this and exchange good practice. They've seen clean tech in action, how communities are going to deal with that, because that's the political difficulty of transition. And then I think such an alliance should try to, reduce rather than exacerbate our common dependencies on critical raw materials for clean tech from China and from other unreliable suppliers. So, if you ask me, I think there are really very practical ways to do this, but I just, unfortunately, I'm a bit depressed on the political side that there would be any traction for this.
I was ready to ask about this. Professor Makiyama on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, there is a big if and there is a big assumption if we even have same objectives when it comes to sustainability. I mean, we all love frameworks. I mean, academics and business, we want to see alliances and we want to see the Star Spangled Banner and the EU flag next to each other, taking on the big bad Asians. That's sort of the part of the game. But the thing is that, we have enough divergences and actually rivalries, especially in the energy field between the EU and the US. And I would maybe I mean, let's assume for a second that there are things that we can do together, but there are some shared common objectives. But I mean, even back in the Biden administration, you know, you had a framework that basically was a double-sided subsidy on both infrastructure and the usage of renewables. What did that create? A huge gap on investment in Europe because obviously everyone was going to the United States, and rightly so. And we see that very much now, even without those subsidies on the ground, because United States is actually the source, one of the two major sources of growth. At the same time as if you look at Europe, if you take all of Europe together in absolute terms, we are delivering around the same amount of growth as Indonesia. You know, it's a zero growth market. Obviously, European corporates are looking to United States, whether you're looking at green or otherwise. And I think it's very important also to remember that even within Europe, we have now huge divergences in terms of how we look upon not just the taxonomy of what we deem as sustainable energy. We also have very different approaches when it comes to mitigating some of the secondary impacts. I'm thinking, for example, like EUDR, the deforestation regulation, where it turns out that actually not even our farmers can actually comply with them, although it was actually designed to keep foreign imports out. That's abundantly clear. So coming down to this question, I mean, once again, even if we have a common objectives, second, is that even feasible? I think the past 4 years have shown that in the competition for investment and capital, there's very little room for coordination. In fact, we are doing the opposite of that. And we have to remember that the transatlantic rivalry is very much true. And in these fields that you're talking about, Elias, we have to remember that Europe's main competitor is still not China. We are still competing against United States on third markets and also in the domestic markets. We see some interesting mergers taking place. I'm thinking not least between GE and Alstom in this space, which has been a game changer. But ultimately, we are still good, fair competitors on the commercial field, and there's nothing wrong with that. And obviously, if you look at the incentives that the regulators put forward, no finance minister or treasurer wants to subsidize foreign companies. It's just a matter of fact. And so obviously we come down to a solution where national treatment is, well, I should say that they are not necessarily in violation of WTO rules or even principles, but we'd rather see investment rather than trade. And that's basically the economic climate as it is. It's not just about politics. As I said, there is no export-led growth to be had at the moment.
Professor Makiyama, you mentioned WTO, and my question is, what is the role of WTO nowadays, actually, in the resilience-focused transatlantic strategy? And you mentioned that we are fair competitors, I mean, EU and US. So could the US and EU manage, to drive reforms on export controls or emergency trade rules here and standardize, let's say some framework for the global market?
Um, well, I can give you the short answer and say no. But I can also give you a more elaborate yes answer and perhaps give a little bit of background where I think we stand. I mean, it also explains some of the reactions that Europe had from the rest of the world regarding our steel TRQs. Just to give a little bit of background, we just introduced safeguard quotas on steel, which is quite unique in itself, but we have also offered to follow the WTO rules and renegotiate our commitment with our trading partners. The immediate response from even within G7 is, why do you bother? Why do you bother following the WTO rules? It's a mixture of bafflement and amazement, and people can't really figure out if we are are we really that elegant and attached to the WTO rules, or if you're just plain outright stupid, as someone actually once asked? I think it explains the European position, which is basically that we know that the WTO is dead and it's not coming back. If multilateral rules are coming back, it's not coming back through the WTO. And we can say the opposite on speeches, but that's basically what everyone thinks. It also puts the whole situation into a completely difficult, different position. Sorry, I got a disruption on the screen. I hope you can still hear me. Maybe, can you still hear me?
Yes.
I can.
All right. Oh, thank you. Okay. Now, what I was saying is that the end of the multilateral system creates a particular problem for Europe because we are the biggest beneficiary of that system. It's not China. The rules are basically designed after Europe, and we have to remember that the Marrakesh Agreement of 1995 was actually signed when we were transitioning Eastern Europe into the multilateral system. They were not designed to tackle China. China can live with these rules for 100 years without running into problems. In short, what I'm trying to say here is that if United States and many other countries have either mentally or physically left the system, and I need to really remind the audience here that USTR is currently conducting an investigation whether they should remain a member of the WTO. But whatever that conclusion, that study is going to be, United States have de facto left. And that puts Europe into a very difficult dilemma because in the end, the US trade deficit of 1.7 or so trillion is largely under MFN. That means that United States is enabling trade-led growth for 1.7 trillion to the value of $1.7 trillion for the rest of the world. Once United States leaves or decide not to follow the rules, you will have cases like we've seen from other countries have repealed cases to the void in the WTO system. There is no incentive to follow the rules. This is the worst kind of European fallacy that we see. Europeans believe that we follow the rules because they are rules. No, that's not how it works. People follow WTO rules because there's an incentive. And there used to be a 1.7 trillion value worth of basically incentives why people follow the rules, in addition to security and rule-based order and yada, yada, yada. That brings Europe to basically a key question. Either we open up our market to that similar kind of value of at least $1 trillion, maybe we can share that burden with the Chinese, or no one will follow the rules. And it's that simple. And I don't see that in the European DNA, that we pay for other people's benefits the way that the Americans have done throughout the Second World War, well, since the 1950s, basically.
Professor Hamilton, on this one, any to add on
Well, I
this?
would just agree. No, I mean, I agree with, and unfortunately, the Trump administration just has little use for the WTO. And it's more a source of transatlantic friction than it is a possible transatlantic alignment. So I just don't think that's a road, that's a positive road at the moment. And I would agree with what Hosuk said.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation we had. Professor Hamilton, Professor Makiyama, it was a pleasure to have you here. I hope next time we'll have you in person here at the Greek Economic Summit.